Talking about difficulty in games can be, well, rather difficult. A game that's too hard for one player may be too easy for another, and just because you're a master at, say, first-person shooters doesn't mean you're an expert at platformers or puzzle games. Your skills don't necessarily carry over from one genre to another in video games, and the standard for how hard a game should be has frequently been a moving target over the years. Back when arcade games were all the rage, games were designed to be more difficult as to squeeze every last quarter out of its player base. This philosophy was so pervasive that it even carried over into the console market for a significant chunk of time, even though the entry cost to play a game was now just a one-time purchase of a cartridge instead of a deluge of pocket change. But as arcades slowly died out and the home console market started to explode, developers began prioritizing how much players actually enjoyed their games as opposed to how much frustration they were willing to put up with before quitting. But even with their hearts in the right place, making a game easier without making it too easy is in itself a challenging task. You have to walk a fine line. If there isn't any struggle involved in saving the world, then it doesn't really feel like that much of an accomplishment. It doesn't make you feel special. And yet that is somehow the developer's job, to make a game that can simultaneously make all of its players feel like the most important person in the world, even if mathematically that's impossible. So how do you essentially create the Goldilocks of video game difficulty, a game that creates a challenge that is just right? Well, there are more than a few different solutions designers have come up with over the years, but there's one game in particular I want to highlight because it has one of the purest approaches to video game difficulty I've ever played. Strap in, folks, because today we're talking about Thumper. What makes Thumper so impressive to me is that it's a game that's difficulty is more mental than physical. It wants you to think it's much harder than it actually is. And I do want to get this out of the way up front. The point of this video is not to say that Thumper is actually an incredibly easy game, and if you're bad at it, then you're a lesser person who just needs to get good at video games. What I do want to take a closer look at, though, is how Thumper actually is able to trick you into playing the game in a more challenging manner, and how that ends up creating a more satisfying experience in the end. So the first part we're going to examine is how the game imposes its difficulty from a mental perspective. For starters, the most obvious component to this is just the overall aesthetic of the game. It's the percussive industrial music, the metallic sheen that covers everything, the eldritch horrors that await you at the end of each level, as well as just the overall relentless sense of speed that makes Thumper feel truly oppressive to the uninitiated. If you look at some of the late game levels being played without any context, it looks impossibly difficult, because you have yet to learn how to read the visual language the game uses. It's a rhythm game at heart, but once you take a few minutes to soak in the atmosphere, you quickly understand why the game's creators prefer to call Thumper a rhythm violence game instead. The other factor that plays a big part in making the game appear difficult is the fact that unlike a lot of other rhythm games, Thumper does not have a selective difficulty level. And to understand why that's important, we need to talk about the broader pros and cons to letting the player select their difficulty. But I promise I'm going to try and not get too lost in the weeds on this one. So, say we take your average shooter or action game. Making a game like this more difficult is commonly a statistical matter. To make your experience harder, the designers simply tweak the damage sliders so that you now deal out much less damage, and in turn, your enemies now dish out much more. The inherent advantage to this strategy is you're allowing the player to better define how challenging they want their experience to be, which in turn means the developer has to spend much less time fine-tuning the game to be the right amount of challenging for the largest number of people. The downside of this method is that this will typically lead to a loss of immersion, since if you're playing a game and you know that you can change the difficulty at any time, it's hard to keep that fact out of the back of your head. And that's something Thumper wants to avoid at all costs. It needs your undivided attention because, like I said earlier, Thumper's challenge is just as much mental as it is physical. By not having a selective difficulty, Thumper is basically taking away the safety net for both you and the developers, because if you end up stuck on a particular level, there's no way to make it easier on yourself. You're no longer having a good time, and it's the designer's fault for not creating a smoother difficulty curve. And this is why it's so important that the game appears to be exceedingly hard, because the creator's solution to this problem is to make the game disappointingly easy when you actually break the gameplay down to its most basic elements. And so the appearance of difficulty is basically overcompensating for that. it balances out the experience by creating the illusion that the game is actually much harder than it is from a mechanical perspective. Based solely on gameplay, the ultimate goal of Thumper is to get your celestial space beetle to the end of the level in one piece. And as with any rhythm game, you'll have plenty of new mechanics thrown at you along the way. To use the parlance of the game's manual, you'll be asked to thump thumps, make turns, shield slide through red bars, jump into blue rings, hold long jumps over spike pits, pound specific thumps to deactivate a boss's shield, and this is just the basics that are covered in the first few levels. Later on, the game throws in laser gates, lane switching, and these weird digital worm-looking things that you need to avoid. But the important thing is, while this seems like a lot to process, there are only a few of those prompts that you have to prioritize hitting to not fail out. To put it as simply as possible, you just need to make sure you don't run into anything. Which means there's really only 3 things you need to worry about. Don't run into walls, don't hit these red bars, and don't crash into the spike pits. There are some of those late game elements I briefly mentioned earlier that can kill you as well, but even after they've been introduced, they come up so infrequently that I would say you can realistically make it through 80 to 85% of Thumper just by making sure you don't mess these 3 things up. This actually gets even easier when you look at the combination of button presses needed to obey our 3 new rules. Want to break through these red bars? Just hold down the A button. Want to jump over these spikes? Just hit the A button and hold up on the analog stick. Want to make a turn? Just move the stick in the direction of the turn while holding down the A button. And to make things even easier, you don't even have to time this right. You can, and if you do nail the timing, you'll get extra points, but as long as you're holding down the stick in the right direction when you hit the turn, it doesn't matter if you started angling in the right direction the second you saw the turn coming up. You can make it through the majority of this game simply by mastering when to press a single button and knowing which direction to hold the analog stick in. So now all of a sudden, Thumper doesn't seem that difficult, right? We have a surefire way to make it safely through most of this game, and I haven't even gotten to the fact that each level is broken into 15 to 30 subsections, and if you do happen to fail a certain section, you just start over at the beginning of that subsection, instead of having to play through the entire level again. So why does everyone keep saying this game is so hard? Well, to be blunt, it's because no one really plays the game like this. Because even though this strategy that we've just laid out will get you through most of the game, it also sucks all the fun out of it. If you're just prioritizing bars, turns, and spikes, then that means you're not hitting these thumps, and you're not jumping into these blue rings, which in turn means you're not syncing up with the music. Playing the game like this turns it into a cacophonous mess. It doesn't feel satisfying. So you start trying to hit every thump, to get every blue ring. You start trying to hit every turn just right. You've subconsciously decided to make the game more challenging on yourself. The game has somehow incentivized you to opt in for a more difficult path because it's more rewarding, because it feels right. It has managed to attain the best of both worlds. It's created an experience that has selective difficulty without sacrificing any of the immersion. And to me, that's really the core of what makes Thumper so fun to play. And this is just kind of the ground level stuff. I haven't even gotten into how, if you time your turns just right, it'll also keep you airborne so you can grab these blue rings. Or how lane switching makes it so that you're constantly taking your thumb off the A button and thus makes you feel more vulnerable. And man, I could do an entirely separate video about how the New Game Plus mode tweaks all of these components in just the right way that makes the game simultaneously harder and yet simpler. But as you can probably see by now, that would quickly spiral into me just gushing about the game, or at least more so than I already have. And they wouldn't really add anything new to how the game handles difficulty. Now, I don't want to come off as someone who thinks games that employ selective difficulty options or don't attempt the absolute purest approach to creating challenge are lazily made. The fact is, selective difficulty is massively helpful for a lot of people, and over time, games have gotten really good at making the difference between playing a game on easy and playing that same game on hard consist of more than just bumping up damage sliders. You have games like The Witcher 3 that fundamentally change some of its systems to make the game harder on a higher difficulty setting. And you have games like the most recent God of War that has the option to change button prompts that normally require rapid taps to just be a sustained hold, which is a great accessibility option for players with certain disabilities. I ultimately wanted to point out the inherent advantages and disadvantages to using selective difficulty in a game. Not to say that those games are necessarily worse off because of it, but to highlight just how hard it is to make an enjoyable game without that system to fall back on. And I don't know that I've ever played a game that is able to wield that double-edged sword quite as elegantly as Thumper. Masterpiece is a term that probably gets thrown around more often than its definition should allow, and I don't know if any game can ever truly be perfect, but what I do know is, if I ever did have to make an argument like that, Thumper is definitely the game I would build it around, and its approach to difficulty has everything to do with that.